speaker series conversation. Ms. Marshall is a community educator, organizer, coach, and executive director of Kids Rethink New Orleans. Kids Rethink New Orleans Schools, She's an African-American woman who works directly with New Orleans youth as a collaborator and an advocate, and she's also a research partner. So she gave us, university researchers, this charge. She wants us to move beyond the, quote, tokenizing, extractive, and capitalistic models of university community research collaborations, end quote, to implement transformative partnerships. So that's why we're here today, and soon we'll hear from a wonderful guest that will help just charge up the conversation and I know inspire us to share more with each other. So Ms. Marshall's charge is so important, and the reason why we're gathering today is so important. It helps remind us of the harm we can do as researchers. It speaks to the fact that research has been and still can be an exploitative enterprise that disproportionately takes advantage of and undervalues communities, particularly communities of color, and those highly impacted by poverty. If we are not careful, it can also lend to the ongoing effects of colonization. So we're here to continue grappling with this. If we're here in this space, in person or virtually, we probably care about these issues anyway, right? But to be in conversation with each other as colleagues and critical friends, I think is a really great opportunity for us. And of course, it's important that we grapple with these issues every day and push forward in conducting research in anti-colonizing and anti-racist ways every day. Today, however, we also recognize at the Crate Center that this is particularly timely, that this is Indigenous Peoples Day. And we would like to acknowledge that the University of Michigan resides on the ancestral territories of the Three Fires people. We recognize the historical and ongoing effects of colonization and Indigenous communities' struggles against state violence and their fight for self-determination and Indigenous sovereignty. We also recognize our responsibility to help advance the justice of Indigenous peoples as much as we can. Today is the first year that Indigenous Peoples Day is being officially recognized by the U.S. government. And we at the Crate Center also acknowledge that that recognition is long overdue. So I actually want to invite us all in person and online to have a moment of silence while there are government officials who are being lauded today for making this act and signing this into recognition, and it's very important that they have done so. I'm inviting us to honor the activists and the educators and other Indigenous community members who have been a part of this fight for so long to have Indigenous Peoples Day officially recognized, both those living and who have passed. So if we could just have a moment of silence in honor of that struggle and also their victories, I think that would be great. Thank you. So now I wish to turn it over briefly to Dr. Tanya Neff-Chang, who I'm also excited has joined the Crate Center this year as a postdoctoral research fellow and whose own research and commitments are so deeply aligned with the anti-racist and decolonizing charge that I spoke to. So, Tanya?
Thank you, Dr. Wilson, and welcome everyone who's here virtually and in person. I'm going to briefly introduce our guests today, and I'll start with Mr. Jared Ten Brink. and tell you just a little bit about who they are as well as the format. So Mr. Ten Brink's research is focused on the empowerment of all peoples through indigenous culturally relevant pedagogies. Currently, he's working on his dissertation using design-based research practices to create curriculum that combines indigenous ways of knowing with core cultural teachings for the Nottawasepi Huron Band of Potawatomi, of which he is a member. Welcome. We'd also like to introduce Dr. Leslie Rupert Herrenkohl, who is a learning scientist and developmental psychologist, and she designs and studies STEM learning in partnership with practitioners and community members living in historically underserved communities. She'll discuss Studio, which is a university community partnership that centers low-income, immigrant, and refugee youth, families, and educators to create STEM learning opportunities and provide pathways to post-secondary education for more youth in the community. Welcome. And we'd also like to welcome Dr. Jenny Sawada. Dr. Sawada's work has roots in participatory action research, and it aims to decenter whiteness and to privilege the voices of BIPOC youth, so Black, Indigenous, and people of color. This research is situated in communities and non-traditional education settings, and it emphasizes practices such as oral history, community narrative, and co-constructed representation. Welcome. So just for our format, we are thinking of our guests today as conversation starters. So rather than providing a lengthy talk, each will have about 5 minutes to briefly share some reflections and some wisdom to get us all started. In addition, I think this will help allow for a dialogue and discussion with our audience. And just as a note, I will give you just a 1 minute time warning. I'll put up a little piece of paper, so just roll with it, and we'll be smooth, I think. Okay. So shall we start with Mr. Ten Brink? Do you mind starting first?
No, I think you have a lot of confidence in me to tell me I'm going to be talking for 5 minutes.
That's all right.
But Bonjour, Jared, Ten Brink, Potawatomi, Nadal, Nottawasepi. Yeah, so my name is Jared. I'm, like it was mentioned, a member of the Nottawasepi Huron Band of Potawatomi. And I have really strong opinions on reciprocity in research. I think that we talk about, where we start with research, and Linda Smith talks about, starts with questions, like who's asking the questions. A lot of people talk about that. And in my own work, I was really informed by that, and that's kind of how I entered. Like I had, even as an insider, so I'm an insider in my community, I had these ideas about what was best for my community, and I still do. I still have those opinions on what I think we need. But when I sat down and actually talked with people, I found out that I had assumptions, I had my own opinions, and that I needed to reset my own privilege. So I think that is, when we think about reciprocity research, is a good spot to start. And I think it starts with the self. It was a year ago, we had another Indigenous Peoples Day talk, and I was part of that, and we spoke about some of the different challenges and whatnot. And I talked with a number of students after that. And I came out of this last year, coming in here, I was really reflecting on actionable steps. And I think that's where I think we need to start. We need to start with our own privilege and our own selves, and then how do we move forward and make this something as part of our own work? Because I don't think it's actually achievable. I want to say that. I don't think reciprocity is, at least with Indigenous populations, and really, because that's my own perspective, but I don't think it's possible. I mean, just talking with people, right, and doing the math, how many projects are going on right now in the School of Education? And how many of those projects involve the people of the Three Fires? And I know one. That's me. And I have a unique perspective. I'm descended from Tepinabe. He signed the treaty at the foot of the rapids. So I'm a descendant of somebody who signed the land that led to this university being founded. And I'm one of the first people in my family to go to this university. We have members who have graduated from the University of Michigan, but there's not very many. And we have research projects that we're working on with other universities in the area, but the University of Michigan isn't really one of them. And I'm not bringing in grant dollars. I'm not bringing in anything. And so, I mean, even if we just talk dollars, capitalistic mindset, like dollars that the university is giving back to the tribe, it's really small, if any. And in fact, I pay, the university, my tribe pays for my attendance here. And I think that's always important to point out, the irony of that. So I'm getting heated and I'm getting off topic a little. So keeping those things in mind, like what do we do if we're grad students we're talking about, or undergrads? And last year, and we've talked about this before, like I said, and you look at like a syllabus, you look at your coursework, you look at everything we do at this university, and we're failing to meet that promise of that was even laid out. And I think one of the things I would say is those who are students need to put fire on the people in front of them. Like it's great if we want to go and we want to talk with the dean, or we want to go to the DEI chair, and we want to have these conversations. But the real conversations need to happen between the student and the teacher, and the student and the advisor. And challenging those people directly. Like if you think this is important, what are the things we can do to do that? So how is it like you've been given an opportunity to speak in a class and lead a conversation around a paper, and maybe the professor then says, bring in a paper. Are you bringing in a paper from an indigenous scholar? Wow, I filled that 5 minutes. Are you bringing in something else? Or even just something from your own perspective, but how are you bringing about reciprocity in the things that you do as a student, as an advisee, and as a researcher, just as a graduate student? Because we can all do something. But I think often we feel like we need to fight the system, we need to do something with the system, and the reality is that the system isn't going to change overnight, and we need to do something now.
Thank you. Thank you for starting us with that insight. Dr. Herrenkohl, would you like to go next, please?
Sure. I'll definitely pick up on some of the threads that I think Jared suggested here, that really, when I think about reciprocity, I think about it as a struggle, to be honest with you. I have a lot of appreciation for the way you just talked about things, Jared, and the impossibility perhaps with indigenous populations in this university, right? But also recognizing that for me, it's become kind of like an aspirational goal and an everyday practice. Those are the two things that I carry with me. And I am, I've spent 25 years trying to do this in many different locations, and it's with a tremendous amount of humility that I do that work, that I think about what does it mean to do this work, that I dare to make mistakes together with other people, right, as we do the work. And especially as somebody who is located within a large Research One institution, and my prior institution was the same, right? So I realize that it feels very challenging to do this work. But I want to talk a little bit about one partnership that has lasted from about 2013 to today, even through my transition here, as a way forward for me about thinking about how to reach toward that aspirational goal, and how to live the practice every day of trying to engage in forms of reciprocity when working in an R1 institution across many lines of difference. So the studio collaboration, as Tanya said, is a collaboration between the University of Washington and a multi-service community-based organization in Seattle that serves the broad needs of the community from birth to death. And inside of that space, I've really drawn on the perspectives of the learning sciences and critical sociocultural theory to provide a way forward in a very similar way to what Jared was talking about in terms of community-based design research. So really thinking about, first and foremost, communities as partners in designing something together. And then you'll notice the research is the last thing in the name, right? So the research comes last. The partnership around the work comes first. And so for me, that's one of the most important things about the way that I try to live into this goal and practice. And in the case of studio, it involved something a little different from my earlier work, which was always with practitioners. Studio actually involves many different partners who have different needs and interests. And they include the out-of-school time educators, youth, families, community members, university undergraduates and graduate students who are serving as mentors in that space. And so it's trying to think about how can we create something together and then understand what we're creating in this space, with the ideal being what Camille, I think, said earlier, a kind of more liberatory counter space to the kinds of spaces we would normally see, both in higher education and maybe in K-12 education for students of color, especially low-income immigrant and refugee students. So that was the first challenge that we faced, and we created a plan and a process that was meant to organize around the benefit primarily at the center for the youth and the mentors. So thinking about the work of staff at the university, staff at the CBO, and families and community members wrapping around the youth and young adults in our community. And so one thing that the community wanted through a needs assessment that was conducted with the adults and youth is more access to college opportunities and college preparation. So we created this program where youth and mentors would be working together, and my expertise is STEM, so we use STEM inside this space to create opportunities for youth and mentors to work on collaborative projects that existed at the intersection of youth interests and mentor expertise. So it was really centering them in that space. And then we would document and discuss what happened in that space in a Friday afternoon seminar. So that happened during the week. And late on Friday afternoons, staff members across the university, the CBO, and the undergraduates and graduate students would gather together to have reflective sessions to think about the practice and to design for future learning opportunities and to reflect on the systemic issues that we saw creeping into those spaces and to kind of have that reflective space there. And then we also work to write about what we do together across the different voices and communicate those things. So it's not just about a researcher's stance, but it's also trying to elevate the stances of other folks within the collaboration. So again, ultimately what we're trying to do is break down those boundaries and create something that not one of our groups could do alone. And to make that the transformative space and the reflective space, knowing that in Jared's words, it will always be a struggle and we'll probably never achieve what we want. But that's the work that we're doing in that space.
Thank you, and what a wonderful companion to what Jared offered as well. So, Sawada, can we hear from you now?
Yeah, so Jared and Leslie, thank you for sharing all of that, because I feel like so much of what you said resonates with my approaches and my work. So I think first I want to pick up on, Leslie, what you said about designing something together with the community and that should come before the research, right? So there was a project that I worked on at a community organization in Detroit, and that was sort of the approach that we took. Was we designed a community history project with not just the staff at this community organization, but also with youth participants. So youth were the ones who really guided us and told us these are the issues that matter to us, and so our work was led in large part by them. And what ended up happening in this space was really cool, because we sort of became a part of the community organization, I think. So outside of researchers, we just worked on so many other things that it wasn't for research, right? It wasn't for the work that we were doing with the university. It was work that we were doing with the community. It was other partnerships that we had with, say, like local environmental organizations and things like that. But that said, I think that it's still, there was always this struggle of, I think in particular, issues of representation, and that was always a tension for me, right? So this wasn't a project that, like, I wasn't PI on this project, but I think that Jared, picking up on the grad student identity, right? There's just so much there in terms of issues of power and what are we able to do as researchers and what are we able to do as graduate student researchers. And so just this tension around issues of representation and whose voices were privileged when it came to things like publications or when it came to things like conference proposals, because, you know, we did certainly open up that space and we said we want our youth participants to be the ones who are speaking here, or to have the opportunity to speak if you want to take that on. But also, it's this space where there are certain voices and there's certain language that's valued. And so if you want to participate in that space, right, it was a little, I feel like it was a little bit harder to try and manage, like, okay, we want to write this proposal, we want to get this thing approved, knowing that some voices are valued and some languages and some ways of speaking are valued, and that's the researcher who is privileged more so than the participants. And so that was always kind of one of the struggles there. For my dissertation, where I was able to work independently, it was a little bit messy because that's not a project that I designed with my youth participants. I didn't know who they were before I designed the study before I knew who my participants would be, but I knew the questions that I wanted to ask. And so that was something that I think was really difficult for me to negotiate, to navigate, because I think what ended up happening for me was, after this project had been designed, then I had to go forward and say, okay, we're here. This is what I put in. This is what IRB said is okay. So now, working with that, what can we as a group, right? Me and my 5 participants, like, what can we do and what can we create together, given sort of given the boundaries that I put on there as the researcher, right? And so keeping in mind that project really privileged my interests and my perspectives, I thought, what are the ways then that I can privilege youth voices here? And so that led to really co-constructing this project. So they, in my dissertation, it's their words in the chapter, so they co-wrote portions of it with me. They've got their own narrative in they introduce themselves, and so I think that I was really happy with that much, that it was their language and their words, but also they worked with me as co-analysts. They worked with me as co-researchers, really, because I came in here, like Jared, with many assumptions about, well, here's what I think as a researcher, and my youth participants were not afraid to say, actually, no, that's not right, and that's not how we see it, and that's not how we think of it. And so it was really just humbling, and it was just a great reminder that this is why we really should try and privilege youth voices and historically underrepresented voices, because I think even being insiders, we come in with so many assumptions. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, thank you all so much. I'm gonna take the liberty to pose a question before we open it up. So Jared shared, as an Indigenous person working with other Indigenous community members, he's mindful of still certain things that shouldn't be taken for granted. And I'm wondering if you each can briefly speak to the ways that your participants or collaborators of color have asserted their culturally relevant sensibilities, and how you have strived to be appropriately responsive as you think about your work? Like any helpful pushback and awareness or consciousness raising that they've contributed to your own journey as a researcher? I think it's another way to think about it. Jenny, you work particularly within Latinx communities and contexts.
Yeah. So I can start with an answer. So I think in my case, right, I identify as Latina, I identify as Mexican, and so I am from originally the borderlands, and I worked with youth in the borderlands. Some of us shared just the same hometown, let's say, just the same context. And in doing this work in my dissertation, I got some pushback around, so I'll be specific, I was framing a lot of what the ways that youth participants were, let's say, engaging with Mexican culture. I was framing it as cultural preservation given the borderlands context and given the ways that I was raised, given the research that's out there. But my participants said, no, we don't see it that way, and there was pushback to this idea of preservation. And that, so, I guess that the way that I addressed it was I said, there's something here, so let's talk about it. And I deferred, because clearly I was not, even coming from the same space, I think just making the assumption that they would see it in the same way that I did, and to frame that, to make that such a big part of my study was really naive. And I think it was I think that was me sort of not recognizing the ways that I was privileging my perspective and my identity as an insider. And so I think that after that was kind of where I decided, you know what, that I think I need to defer, because I don't know. I don't know the ways that things have changed. I don't know how you view it as compared to how I view it. And so I think that sort of created the space for pushback from them, but also pushback sort of a little bit more broadly, to push back on the literature that's out there on things like cultural preservation and on just the ways that we see the borderlands.
Thank you.
Yeah, when you asked the question, actually the first thing that jumped in my head was actually not a conversation I had with faculty, with people in the field. Like I was that in my community. Technically, I guess they are in my community. It was another Indigenous scholar. Kyle White, who's over in C's. Kyle is on my committee. By the way, Leslie's my advisor, so if you hear me talk about advising relationships, it's because we've had a very good one. But Kyle pointed out to me, I had conversations with tribal leadership about something, and then I was like, this is what I'm going to do for my next step. And Kyle was like, well, you're talking with all of these men, is what I was doing. And he said, but historically, women would have been responsible for what you're talking about. But colonization really led to a lot of changes in how our societies were structured, with hunting, gathering, and subsistence living. And so roles changed because of that, and the community is working to correct that. And so then it was how is my work going to even again be informed by these practices, and how are we working to kind of counter this? And so that's something that kind of jumped to mind. But the other thing that always comes to mind too is I sat down once and had a conversation with a group of elders. And talking with tribal elders is a long process, is how I would put it. Because when you ask them a question, they're going to answer that question eventually. And I think that was one of the things, too, that I really learned. I didn't grow up in a really dense tribal household. I grew up in my mother's culture really dominated the household. So to sit down and ask a question, you answer the question. But when you sit down and ask a question in a tribal community, they're going to tell you a couple of stories first. And I guess that's what I'm doing here right now, is telling a bit of stories. So I think that was, I don't know if that's answering your question or not, but I guess you kind of have to be prepared to to when you're sitting down in these community conversations, it's not even just like your own perspectives, it's like the whole process, the whole methodology that you might have in mind. Like, I'm going to do this semi-structured interview, it's going to be completely different. And then I was sitting here writing down notes, and one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is like, what makes something like an indigenous methodology or indigenous practice? And it isn't the question, it isn't the fact that you're asking questions, it's all the other things around it. And when you're working with communities, like in this situation too, as researchers, we have to be prepared for the fact that when you come in, you're going to do a lot of work on the front end. And that's something I've learned in this dissertation, is that there's a lot of additional like front end things that you have to do in building relationships and building trust with that community. And it's on us to do that. Like, you know, it's, hi, I'm from the University of Michigan and I'm here to help. Like, nobody wants to hear that. Like, because when you're talking about these communities, right, historically, that's not what we were there. We're here to help. And Vine Gloria talks about it in one of his books. He talks about anthropologists and coming into the communities. Custer Died for Your Sins is the book. It's great. He talks about how anthropologists came in and they were like, oh, all these indigenous people, they're so unhappy. They should celebrate more. They're all just worrying about like living. They don't dance anymore. They've lost their culture. They should dance more. And then next thing you know, we're like powwows every summer. Well, historically, in the summertime, we would have been hunting and gathering and preparing for the winter. And so I love powwows. They're a lot of fun. If you've never gone, you should go. But they're not all we are. But it became this thing. And a lot of that can be traced back to, I'm from the university and I'm here to help.
Yeah, that's really helpful, Jared. I think, you know, there's so many instances, Camille. I'm trying to choose a few key ones. As a white woman, I work primarily in low-income immigrant and refugee communities from all over the world inside of Studio. Most often, it's immigrants from East Africa, Somalia in particular, and then also Vietnamese immigrants as well inside that space, and then some historically African-American families in the region are a part of the community. And one of the things that happens is that the undergraduates who want to work in that space also are immigrants, refugees, and low-income students primarily, and women. And the cultures that they come from are often from the Middle East, from Southeast Asia, or other parts of Asia, and African-American students sometimes in that space, and some white students. So there's very little cultural congruence in terms of the relationship between the mentors and the youth. And so one of the things that I found very early on is that often there were multiple perspectives coming from multiple cultural positions. And that was something that I needed to learn how to navigate. Like, so for instance, some of the mentors early on were arguing that they wanted more of a role, and that's how we ended up thinking about what do mentors have to offer inside the space. We were allowing the community-based organization to drive a lot of what was happening in that space, and mentors stepped forward as immigrant, refugee, low-income students to say, we want to drive more of what's happening in this space, and they pushed against the staff members in that way, me at the university, and also the OST folks in that space. So that transformed the way we work together with the youth. So I would say that was one really, really big challenge. And another issue is that we also work across religious lines, and it became important to think about the ways that we allowed the practice of Muslim prayer to take place during the time that we gathered. And in certain years, we had different practices that were informed by the ways in which the youth and the families and other community members felt like was important. So there was a mosque within a short distance that students could walk to if they wanted to. There was a protected room where they could pray on location. So there were all sorts of ways that we tried to figure out how to accommodate the needs of very many different cultural groups inside of this space. And I would say that it's probably one of the most challenging spaces to work in, because you're really trying to work across these many lines of difference at once, and then think about how to enact something collectively that allows us to be a community we couldn't be otherwise, and to work with one another across those lines of difference in respectful ways. So I feel like there were real opportunities to learn inside those spaces as well, across lines of difference. And I would say the way that that resulted in research practice is kind of thinking about how the students began to recognize what does it mean to build solidarity. So especially for the youth and the mentors, there was lots of conversation about what does it mean to work across these lines and how are we doing it, and reflexivity about that, and then wanting to have what we were writing reflect what we were learning in that space. And I find that that's actually where it's harder to find connections with the literature, to be honest with you, because there's almost always kind of within group or individual cross-group examples, but it's harder to find examples of building that solidarity that doesn't reduce solidarity to something that feels like a soundbite and not a real thing. And so it's harder to figure out how to connect up with working across so many lines of difference at once, including, you know, immigration, language, race, religion, like all of these things are in the mix. And so how do we think about the ways in which we identify in all our multiplicity and show up in these spaces, and then do justice to research that helps us understand that. So I'm all ears from all of you about how to do that work and how to do it honestly and allow voices both of individuals and of a collective that is greater than the sum of all the individuals right in that space. But that feels to me like the biggest challenge that we confront, to be honest with you.
Thank you so much. And I also want to acknowledge, you know, this kind of candor also brings forth vulnerability, and we appreciate so much your sharing and your critical reflection. So now, most definitely, we want to touch base with those who have joined us in person, and also do a check-in online for comments, questions. So I will open it up. Eunice has joined us, is also a member of the Create Center staff, is our social media visual extraordinaire who's moderating online. Is there a comment or question?
No, there was a comment earlier from Leslie, from Denise saying yes to Leslie. So.
Yes.
I mean, I was just thinking, well, first of all, thank you to the three of you so much for the beautiful ways in which you're inviting us into your thinking about how you do the work you do and the sets of challenges and like tensions that you find in that. I think this kind of conversation is exactly the kind of conversation we need to be making lots of like, serious space for. So I really appreciate that. And the thing that I kept thinking about was, in a way, very much related to what Leslie just ended with, which was each of you talked about tensions and problems, and whether that was like the difference between your aspirations in the day-to-day or posing questions before you're engaged deeply in a community, even if you're from that community. And so I don't think it would be great if you had answers to this. I think you probably don't, because I don't know that we do, but I'd love to hear what would you want young and expert scholars to do to be really aware of and to track on the tensions and the problems that you name, so that they can then seek to solve them or to continue to address those problems all of you made up. It's a kind of a big question.
Well, I think, Simona, one of the things I would say is that I think I want the university and research traditions to pay attention to that. Like, I think I would take it off the shoulders of the individual young scholars and start saying that one of the challenges of doing this work that we haven't yet named is that you spend so much time doing the work, and when research comes last, right, there are certain things that have to be recognized inside of that I think we haven't yet named, and this institution and others are not really prepared to address that, right? They want you to go in with your pre-formed questions, collect your data, and as Camille opened us, like think about it as an extractive thing, as if you already know. And I think that one of the biggest challenges we face is
is the institutions we sit in right now. How do we transform them to be more attentive to the kinds of work that we're talking about, and to nurture people who want to do this kind of work, even though it feels, as Jared said, utterly impossible to do.
Yeah, and I mean, I'll connect to that and name it even more explicitly, right? So we have to talk about promotion and tenure for faculty, right? And as universities, including this one, increases the invitation, if not expectation, for public scholarship and community engagement, we have to translate that into rewards for promotion and tenure, right? And then I love, Jared, that you brought in the advisor relationship into the mix, and also your conversation, with another Indigenous scholar, because we also, as faculty, have to think about how we support students on this journey that takes more time, right, than doing traditional research, and that has implications for money, right, for financing a doctoral education, and the social, just a different type of social emotional support, right? I think that this work calls for. So, yeah.
Money, I think, is an important point
Yeah.
with this conversation, because part of being like on a tenure track or any of this is having money to pay for this, which means grants. And this is one of those things that's beyond our control, but maybe we need to start looking at how do we write grants, how do we do grants, and have those conversations to meet those goals. Because the reality is a lot of funding organizations, right, they want that extractive work, like you're saying. It's beyond us, the US government, right? You want an NSF grant, an NIH grant, they're looking for particular things. Now, there are some grants that are out there that are specifically focused on these communities. Then it's interesting that the numbers involved as far as dollars is usually small, right? So we as an institution need to look at how are we writing grants, what are we even going for as far as grants, and how are we bringing in and funding these projects, because that's the reality of the world we live in. And those groups out there, they have their priorities, right? And a lot of times our questions are even informed by the grant. So how are we seeking out grants that fit into that system, I guess? And what supports can the university provide?
So I'm thinking about how, this nature of our work being extractive, it's known to us, and I think it's also known to the communities we work in, but not necessarily. They may or may not necessarily be naming it as a problem. What I mean by that, I mean, they might know it's a problem, but they might not be naming it as a problem. And so it's happened to me sometimes where, for example, I'll be working in a community setting, and if there's a conversation about reciprocity, which I will always try to elevate, the requests made of me are very much in that space of thinking of our institution as extractive. I think things like, can you offer us English classes? And do you have tutoring available? So I guess what I'm trying to say is we are, as an institution, reproducing norms of what's believed that we have to offer that actually is often harmful. So I know, for example, I would rather not be thinking of, English teaching has a long history of colonization, right? So if I'm taking English teaching to my community partner, that's what they're seeing me. They're sort of seeing me as representing an institution that offers this knowledge base that is also a problematic knowledge base. You know what I mean? I'm not saying you're very well. I feel like you're rambling, but the point is, it's a strange thing to be in a place where you're trying to have a conversation about reciprocity, but you're known to be extractive. And so the requests made of you are in that space. And I'd like to be able to, shake free of that, but it takes some work. I think in that point about time, it takes really the relationship to develop to be able to talk about, if this is
tutoring is what you want, the college preparation services is what you want, English teaching is what you're looking for, then I'm not going to close that door by all means, but I would love to expand the notion of how I can be of use to your community. Have you found yourselves in positions like that? I guess is what I'm wondering. And am I framing it as I don't know if you my framing you find, I would appreciate it, giving critical feedback on that framing. Yeah.
Well, I guess that I'm just thinking about this. So it's hard for me not to think about my family and my parents who came in here as immigrants and who would have probably asked for the same thing, and they probably would have asked for English, they probably would have asked for tutoring, because I think that there is, so the tension here, right, is that we want to push back on this, but this is also what the reality that we live in, and this is what we need to succeed, right? So English is really important. As much as we want to push back on all of the ugly history around the teaching of English and assimilation, it's also still our reality. And so I think that sort of going back to what you said, Leslie, I think that that's something where as researchers we need to do something here institutionally, right? And I don't have an answer as far, because I think you're right? It's this really just ugly history, but it's so important, and it is, I think that I think that a lot of, maybe that's what's asked for, because in developing that relationship, there is some confidence in coming to you and saying, like, we have this university researcher, this incredible person who can give us these access to these resources that we otherwise might not have. I don't think I answered your question, but I recognize the tension that's there, but I also recognize the importance of these things that we, as an institution, do offer and can offer, rather, even if we want to do more than that, it's still so important. And I mean, like I said, I think about my parents, and my mom who never spoke English, and it was something that she wanted, but again, the issue there was access. Yeah.
I would just echo what Jenny just said, from my experience as well, as I appreciate the tension, but I have to tell you, sitting as a representative of a Research One institution, when families are saying they want access to college and it's something you could help prepare them to do, you feel, and thankfully the University of Washington built out a project called the DREAM Project, and that's what they did. So we had centers all around the city where undergraduates would help kids get through the college application process, starting in middle school, kind of asking and answering questions and those kinds of things. So there were institutional things that the university was doing that I felt like I could connect people up to, because ultimately in the end, I also felt like, honestly, they would look at you, look, what good are you if you can't even do this for me, right? And so, I mean, honestly, in that I live in that tension routinely about what am I supposed to do, and how is it that these institutions systemically, as they're arranged now, as Jenny's saying, right, it systematically excludes certain people from access, and then when they ask for access, I can't do anything about it. And so I've lived in that space long enough, and that's where a lot of the humility comes from, the fact that you get asked these things routinely, and it is very difficult to try to figure out how to tell somebody you can't, we provided English classes at schools. I've, connected people to the DREAM Project. I've done all of those things. And it's not that I don't understand what you're saying, but I just don't know how to live in the contradiction of the system that's broken, that we live in, that people want access to, and the transformation we want to make. And so I think living in that space is really hard, and just welcome ongoing conversations about how you're doing it and how we're all doing it right in that space.
Yeah, I think I'm mindful of our time and mindful that we've arrived at what Ann Ishimaru, who's a wonderful community engaged researcher at the University of Washington, calls a juicy tension. Right? And I've experienced this myself too, and I also just want to acknowledge how relevant racial justice and countering anti-Blackness is in this work that we do, and my own research practice partnership related to dismantling the school to prison pipeline that both involves community and youth researchers, but was specifically called for and inspired by community residents, Black community residents of Detroit. So I want to acknowledge them in this space as well. And just think of this tension also resonates with me and my work that I've done with community organizers and residents that has led me to also be careful about how we can over-romanticize and over-intellectualize some of these issues, right? And just sometimes just honor what people are asking for and not think that we know better than them and what they ask for. And we, in our team, particularly experienced this issue as we were striving to co-design, but our collaborators asked, we want a workshop. They definitely were co-designers in some spaces, but they were also very clear, we need you to tell us how to do this. And the language of community organizers is training, right? And so we had a lot of rich discussion about that, and we had to get over ourselves, right? and adjust ourselves and be respectful of what they were asking for, their paradigm, their motivations, and their needs, right? And then that was just demanded more negotiation, right? And some lost sleep, right? But it just speaks to the messiness of this work, but messiness in not a bad way, like a messiness that compels us to be asking these hard questions and being vulnerable and admitting that we've made mistakes and admitting that there's so much more to do as we do better in being justice-driven collaborators and researchers. So we actually call this conversation start. These conversation starters, we definitely hope the conversation will continue amongst ourselves and with our partners, collaborators, colleagues. It is 1:00 now, 1:01, so I want to thank everyone for joining us online and in this space, and I hope you'll stay connected to each other and also to the Crate Center as much as we're able to just offer more opportunities to bring us together. So thank you so much.